It began, as these stories often do, with something that seemed too absurd to be real. A property dispute that looked minor on paper, but in reality would spiral into a war that pitted one man against an entire homeowners association. And like every war, it started with a quiet act of arrogance, one that would set the stage for consequences no one involved could have imagined. The ranch sat on the outskirts of a rapidly growing suburban neighborhood. Once this area had been nothing but rolling hills, pastures, and cattle. But as cities expanded, developers carved up farmland and meadows into neat little boxes of homes, each tucked inside the tidy confines of an HOA. The ranch was the lone holdout, a wide expanse of property that stretched across several hundred acres, bordered on one side by a creek that had flowed undisturbed for generations. The homeowners association, however, had a problem. Their sprawling subdivision was growing, and with growth came demand, especially for water. What had once been a modest development of families was transforming into a lucrative empire for the HOA board and its allied developers. But the existing municipal water connections were not enough to sustain their expansion. The nearest pumping station was already at capacity. They needed more supply, and they needed it fast. That's when someone on the board noticed the creek. The HOA hired consultants, engineers, and lawyers, and in a move that shocked even their own residents, they made plans to dig a small-scale pipeline. It would run through the rancher's property, connect directly to the creek, and deliver water straight into the subdivision's infrastructure. Now, anyone with common sense would assume they'd need permission. They'd need to negotiate, purchase rights, or at the very least, offer a contract. But the board believed they were too clever for that. They told themselves the creek was technically public water, that their lawyers would defend them, and that the rancher, isolated, quiet, and outnumbered, wouldn't dare fight back. So one morning, heavy equipment arrived. Bulldozers carved a scar through the ranch's fields. Work crews lowered sections of pipe into a trench, welding them together under the sun. Within weeks, the line was complete. They disguised the entrance point along the creek with rocks and brush, as if hoping no one would notice. But of course, someone did. The rancher noticed immediately. He knew every inch of that land, every bend of the creek, every fence post he had hammered in himself. At first, he thought it was some kind of mistake, maybe a municipal project. But when he traced the line and saw it disappear into the subdivision, he realized exactly what had happened. The HOA had stolen from him. Not just property, but water. And water, in that part of the country, was more than just a resource. It was lifeblood. At first, he considered the traditional routes, calling the county, hiring lawyers, demanding restitution. But he quickly realized what he was up against. The HOA board was well-connected, entrenched in local politics, and had deep pockets from homeowner fees. They could drag out lawsuits for years, bury him in paperwork, and spin the narrative to their favor. Even if he won eventually, they'd exhaust him financially in the process. But what the HOA underestimated was not his money or his patience. It was his resolve. The rancher wasn't about to be bullied off his own land. If they wanted to wage war over water, he would fight on terms they hadn't considered. That's when he remembered something. The creek that ran through his property wasn't just an isolated stream. It was fed by a spring miles upstream, deep in the hills. That spring was the true source, the origin of every drop that eventually passed through his ranch and into the HOA's illegal pipeline. He began to research. Quietly, carefully, he combed through county records, land deeds, and water rights. And what he discovered was shocking. The spring was located on a small tract of land that had recently gone up for sale. A piece of property no bigger than 10 acres, owned by a family that had fallen on hard times and wanted to liquidate quickly. The HOA hadn't noticed it yet. They were too focused on their pipeline, too confident in their theft. But the rancher noticed. And before the board could even sniff the opportunity, he made his move. He bought the land. Cash. The deed transferred to his name in a matter of days. And with that, the entire water supply for the subdivision, the water running through their shiny new pipeline, belonged to him. For a time, he said nothing. He watched as the subdivision expanded, as the HOA bragged about their new infrastructure, as residents grew comfortable with the endless water flowing into their homes and lawns. They had no idea that it all hinged on a single decision he had already made, the decision to cut them off. When he acted, it wasn't with noise or fanfare. It was simple. One morning, he hiked up to the spring with a set of tools. He installed a shut-off valve directly at the source, and then, with a steady turn of the wrench, he stopped the flow. The subdivision's sprinklers sputtered. Faucets ran dry. Dishwashers failed mid-cycle. Families called plumbers, thinking it was a leak. But within hours, panic spread as the truth became clear. The entire neighborhood had lost water, and the HOA board, scrambling, realized something even worse. Their precious pipeline, the one they had built in arrogance and secrecy, was nothing more than a hollow tube now. Without the spring, they had nothing. The rancher didn't need to shout, didn't need to confront them face to face. His message was already delivered. If they wanted water, they'd have to come through him, but this was only the beginning. Because the HOA wasn't about to roll over. They were powerful, they were angry, and they were about to retaliate. And what followed would turn a simple land dispute into one of the most brutal property wars the county had ever seen. When the taps first ran dry, the homeowners thought it was a glitch. After all, suburban neighborhoods aren't supposed to lose water overnight. They were used to convenience, to amenities always working on demand. At first, they called plumbers, convinced there was a burst pipe or a clogged line. But when dozens of families all reported the same problem, confusion turned into panic. By the second day, lawns browned under the sun. Sprinklers sat useless, hoses limp on driveways. Families carted bottled water into their kitchens just to cook meals. Showers became short and rationed if they happened at all. Children complained, pets whined, and parents fumed. The HOA board was flooded with angry calls. The board scrambled to respond. They sent out vague emails assuring residents that infrastructure challenges were being addressed and that service would be restored soon. But behind closed doors, the truth became clear. They had no control. The pipeline they had spent so much money on, the one they had used HOA dues to secretly finance, was bone dry. They traced the problem back to the creek. Crews inspected the intake hidden along the bank, but the water was reduced to a trickle. That's when whispers started. Some workers hinted at what they had discovered. The spring that fed the creek had been shut off. Someone, somehow, had closed it upstream. The board didn't want to admit it publicly, but they knew exactly who had done it. There was only one person who stood to gain, only one man who had a reason to cut them off: the rancher. Their arrogance, the decision to trespass and steal water, had finally caught up with them. But rather than back down, the HOA doubled down. The first move they made was legal. Within a week, they filed a lawsuit claiming the creek was a public resource and that the rancher was unlawfully obstructing it. They petitioned the county to order the water turned back on. The board assured their residents that the courts would restore fairness and that justice was on their side, but the rancher had done his homework. He wasn't obstructing a public waterway. He was controlling a private spring on private land he now owned. The paperwork was ironclad. When the matter reached a judge, the HOA's claim was dismissed. The court recognized his ownership and his right to manage the spring however he chose. This was a devastating blow to the board's pride. For the first time, their legal maneuvers had failed. But instead of stopping, they escalated. Next came intimidation. Trucks began to idle at the edges of the ranch late at night. Headlights pointed at the property line. Drones buzzed overhead during the day, hovering just long enough to make their presence felt. The rancher noticed fences mysteriously cut, cattle spooked, equipment tampered with. Small acts of sabotage that were clearly designed to send a message: you can't fight us. But the rancher didn't bend. He reinforced his property lines, installed cameras, and made it clear he was watching. He wasn't about to be bullied into surrendering his rights. The HOA board, however, had something else on their side: desperation. As days turned into weeks, the subdivision's residents grew restless. Tempers flared during board meetings. People accused the HOA of mismanagement, of hiding the truth, of spending their money recklessly. Rumors spread about the secret pipeline and the board's illegal construction on private land. Some families even considered moving out, fearing their property values would collapse without reliable water. The board realized they were on the brink of losing everything: their authority, their control, and their reputations. So they made their boldest move yet. Late one night, without permits or permission, HOA hired contractors returned to the creek. This time they bypassed the spring entirely. They set up pumps and hoses directly at the rancher's creek bank, siphoning whatever flow trickled downstream. It wasn't much, but it was enough to deliver a temporary fix. Water pressure sputtered back into the subdivision, and the board proudly announced that they had restored service. But their victory was short-lived. The rancher discovered the pumps the next morning, humming noisily along the creek. He knew exactly what the board was doing, and he knew that if they could get away with this once, they'd do it again and again. This was no longer about water, it was about power. So he struck back. That evening, he hiked to the pumps, documenting everything with photos and video. He caught the illegal setup in detail, the pipes, the stolen flow, even the contractor's trucks parked nearby. Armed with evidence, he filed a formal complaint with the county and the state water authority. What followed was chaos. Officials arrived days later and confirmed the pumps were unlawful. The HOA was slapped with fines, hefty ones, for tampering with water resources and trespassing. Their equipment was confiscated, their contractors ordered off the property. The subdivision was once again cut off, left high and dry. For the residents, it was the last straw. They had tolerated inconvenience for weeks, but now their patience was gone. Crowds formed at HOA meetings, shouting down board members, demanding resignations. Some homeowners even threatened to sue the HOA themselves for mismanagement and fraud. The rancher watched all of this unfold from a distance. He hadn't lifted a hand against his neighbors. He hadn't trespassed, sabotaged, or lied. All he had done was defend his rights and enforce boundaries that should never have been crossed. And yet, it was the HOA board that looked like villains in the eyes of their own community. But the rancher knew it wasn't over. People like that board, entitled, arrogant, convinced of their own authority, didn't simply walk away. If anything, their failures had only cornered them further. And cornered people, especially those with money and power, were dangerous. He expected another lawsuit. He expected more sabotage. But what came next surprised even him. The HOA didn't just want to win anymore, they wanted revenge. And their next plan wasn't about water or legality or fairness. It was about destroying him, piece by piece, until he was forced to give up the fight. The first hint of this came when the rancher noticed unfamiliar survey markers along the edge of his land. Bright flags driven into the soil, spaced evenly in a line that didn't match any of his boundaries. When he investigated, he learned the truth. The HOA had filed a petition to seize part of his property through eminent domain, claiming it was necessary for community infrastructure. They weren't just stealing water anymore. They were trying to steal his land. The war that began with a hidden pipeline was now spiraling into something much larger. The board was ready to drag him into the dirtiest, most ruthless fight of his life. And the rancher? He was ready to show them just how far he was willing to go. The survey flags were the first warning. Bright strips of neon fabric fluttering in the wind, staked neatly along the ranch's property line, cutting across a stretch of pasture that had been undisturbed for decades. To the rancher, they were more than just markers. They were a declaration of war. When he traced the line, his suspicion was confirmed. The flags outlined a narrow corridor that cut from the subdivision's edge down toward the creek. The very path the HOA had illegally carved out with their pipeline. It was as if they were trying to formalize their theft, turning an act of trespass into a permanent right-of-way. And then the letter arrived. A thick envelope stamped with the seal of a local law firm, delivered by courier instead of mail. Inside was the HOA's petition. The board had filed a claim with the county, seeking to seize the flagged land through eminent domain. Their argument was simple. The subdivision required access to water infrastructure, and this access was vital for the community's welfare. On paper, it sounded official, polished, almost reasonable. But anyone who knew the truth could see it for what it was, a power play. The HOA had failed to bully him through intimidation. They had failed to beat him in court. Now they wanted the county to do their dirty work for them. The rancher read the letter slowly, his jaw tightening with each paragraph. He knew how these things worked. Eminent domain was a tool often abused by developers and municipalities alike, sold to the public as progress, but used in reality to strip individuals of their rights. And while the board's case was flimsy, he also knew the HOA's influence ran deep. They had allies in local politics, connections in planning departments, and the money to push narratives in the press. Almost immediately, the smear campaign began. Local newspapers, ones that conveniently received ad revenue from real estate developers, ran stories about the selfish rancher who was hoarding resources while families in the subdivision suffered. Anonymous online posts painted him as a recluse, a miser, even an environmental hazard. They framed the water dispute not as theft by the HOA, but as neglect by him. Residents of the subdivision, already desperate after weeks without reliable water, latched onto the narrative. Anger that had once been directed at the board began to shift. Some residents drove past his ranch shouting insults. Others left threatening notes at his gates. The board had successfully twisted the story, turning neighbors into pawns in their campaign. But what they didn't realize was that the rancher wasn't alone. Quietly, without fanfare, he had begun building alliances of his own. You see, water rights weren't just his concern. Farmers downstream relied on the creek too. Smaller landowners, people who had been pushed around by developers and HOAs before, were watching closely. They knew if the board succeeded in stealing his spring, their own livelihoods would be next. One by one, they reached out. Offers of support came in, legal advice, political connections, even financial backing. So, while the HOA strutted into the county courthouse with their polished lawyers and glossy presentations, the rancher arrived armed with something more powerful: truth, evidence, and a community of his own. The hearings were tense. The HOA argued their case with theatrical flair, talking about community needs and the greater good. They paraded charts and maps, framing the subdivision's growth as inevitable and portraying the rancher as an obstacle to progress. But when it was his turn, the rancher laid out the facts with brutal clarity. He showed the court photos of the illegal pipeline, the trespassing, the sabotage, the pumps hidden on his creek. He revealed the fines already levied against the HOA, the lawsuits dismissed in his favor, and the property deeds proving his legal rights to the spring. Most damning of all, he exposed the board's misuse of HOA funds, money taken from unsuspecting homeowners to bankroll their illegal pipeline. The courtroom grew silent as the story unfolded. What had seemed at first like a fight over water was revealed to be something darker, a conspiracy of arrogance and greed. When the ruling came, it was decisive. The county rejected the HOA's petition outright. Not only did they fail to secure eminent domain, but the board was now under investigation for fraud and mismanagement of funds. For the rancher, it was a victory. But it wasn't the end. The HOA board, humiliated in public, lashed out. They held emergency meetings behind closed doors, scrambling to salvage their reputation. Residents, furious over being misled, demanded answers. Lawsuits from within the subdivision began piling up as homeowners sought to recover their wasted dues. And yet, even cornered, the board refused to admit defeat. If they couldn't steal water legally, they'd try another way. The next wave of attacks came not through the courts, but through sabotage. Fences along the ranch began to fall again, cut in the night. Strange chemical spills appeared near grazing areas, poisoning patches of grass. One morning, the rancher found tire tracks leading straight to the spring itself, evidence that someone had tried unsuccessfully to tamper with his shutoff valve. These weren't random acts. They were calculated. Desperate measures from people who had lost too much and were willing to risk more. The rancher, however, was prepared. Every incident was documented, reported, and tied back to the HOA. With each act of sabotage, their case weakened further, painting them as reckless aggressors instead of concerned neighbors. Still, the rancher couldn't ignore the toll it was taking. His once quiet life had become a battleground. Nights were sleepless, filled with the hum of drones or the glare of headlights on his property line. Days were consumed with paperwork, hearings, and constant vigilance. And yet, through it all, he never considered surrender, because he understood something the HOA never did: the land, the water, the rights. They weren't just property. They were principle. If he gave in even once, the floodgates would open for every board, every developer, every arrogant group that thought they could take what they wanted. And so, he held firm. But even as he weathered their attacks, the rancher was planning something bigger. He wasn't content to merely defend anymore. The HOA had shown their hand. They would stop at nothing to crush him. That meant the only way to win was to strike harder, deeper, and in a way they could never recover from. His opportunity came in the form of documents he uncovered while researching water rights. Buried in county records, he found something extraordinary. The HOA's subdivision didn't just rely on his spring. Over time, they had illegally rerouted smaller tributaries, dug unauthorized ditches, and siphoned water without permits. For years, they had been breaking the law under the radar. The rancher realized he was sitting on a weapon, a legal time bomb that could dismantle the HOA entirely. If he exposed it properly, the board wouldn't just lose their water. They'd lose their power, their funding, and possibly even their freedom. The rancher began preparing carefully, gathering every piece of evidence, every document, every photo. He was building a case not just to defend his land, but to destroy the board once and for all. And while the HOA celebrated small victories, slandering him in the press, harassing him on his property, he worked quietly, methodically, waiting for the perfect moment to strike back. Because the rancher knew something they didn't. The fight wasn't about a pipeline anymore. It wasn't even about water. It was about who would survive when everything the HOA built came crashing down, and he was ready to be the one still standing. By now, the subdivision was a powder keg. Residents who once trusted the HOA board now questioned every word. The promises of restored service had proven empty. And the truth, that their water had been stolen from a rancher's spring, spread faster than the board could contain it. At neighborhood meetings, the board faced shouting matches instead of applause. People waved their skyrocketing bills, furious about the money wasted on a useless pipeline. Families accused them of fraud, demanded refunds, and threatened to bring their own lawsuits. The once confident board members sat behind folding tables, sweating under fluorescent lights, trying to maintain control of rooms that had turned hostile. The rancher, meanwhile, was biding his time. Every late-night sabotage attempt, every smear campaign, every whisper of corruption only strengthened his case. He had photos, videos, official citations, and now, thanks to the county records, proof that the HOA had been stealing water for years, long before the pipeline ever reached his land. He knew he couldn't just hand over the evidence casually. The board had friends in local offices, and if it landed in the wrong hands, it might disappear before it ever saw daylight. Instead, he went higher. He compiled his findings into a comprehensive report and sent it directly to the State Water Authority. The reaction was swift. Within weeks, investigators descended on the subdivision. White trucks with official logos rolled into the neighborhood, and agents in reflective vests began inspecting ditches, measuring flows, and photographing every unauthorized connection. Residents peered out from behind curtains, watching as their model community was exposed piece by piece. When the results of the investigation were made public, the HOA's carefully constructed image shattered completely. The report confirmed everything. The subdivision had been diverting water illegally for years, building without permits, and ignoring environmental regulations. Fines were levied in the hundreds of thousands. Permits were revoked, and the board members themselves were named as responsible parties. The fallout was immediate. Local news outlets, which had once parroted the HOA's smear campaigns, now ran headlines about corruption and abuse. Reporters stood outside the subdivision, microphones in hand, capturing footage of angry residents demanding answers. Former allies in the county offices distanced themselves, eager to avoid being dragged into the scandal. The HOA board was collapsing from within. Members resigned under pressure one after another until only a handful remained. And those who clung to their positions did so out of desperation, not loyalty. Their credibility was gone, their power slipping away by the day. For the rancher, it should have felt like victory. He had exposed them, humiliated them, and watched their empire crumble. But he knew better than to celebrate too soon. People like that board didn't just accept defeat. They clawed, schemed, and fought until the very end. And he was right. The last remaining members of the board launched one final smear campaign. They paid for ads in local papers, framing him as a vindictive landowner who had ruined a community. They claimed children were suffering without water, that elderly residents were at risk, that property values were collapsing because of his selfishness. They knew their legal avenues were gone. Their financial resources were dwindling. Their reputations were destroyed. All they had left was spite. If they couldn't win, they would try to drag him down with them, but this time the community didn't buy it. The residents had seen too much. They knew the water had been stolen. They knew their dues had been wasted. They knew the board had lied again and again. And instead of turning against the rancher, they turned on the last remaining board members. The meetings grew uglier than ever. Residents shouted for resignations, called for audits, and demanded to see every record of how their money had been spent. Some families stopped paying their dues altogether, starving the HOA of its remaining funds. Others circulated petitions to dissolve the HOA entirely. The subdivision that once stood as a pristine example of suburban order was unraveling. Lawns grew unkempt as residents abandoned water-hungry landscaping. Community amenities fell into disrepair. The board's authority evaporated, leaving chaos in its place. Through it all, the rancher remained quiet. He didn't gloat, didn't boast, didn't step forward to claim credit. He let the evidence, the investigations, and the community's own outrage speak for him, but even as the board collapsed, he knew the danger wasn't gone. Desperate people could be reckless, and when their reputations, their money, and their sense of power were stripped away, they might lash out in ways that went beyond sabotage. The rancher had already seen the signs. More tire tracks near his spring. Strange vehicles parked along the road at night. The occasional crack of a rifle echoing too close to his property for comfort. These weren't random acts anymore. They were warnings. And then it happened. One morning, the rancher found the gate to his ranch hanging open. The lock had been cut clean through. When he followed the dirt path down toward the creek, his heart sank. The shutoff valve at the spring, the one piece of leverage he had relied on from the beginning, had been smashed with heavy tools. The metal was twisted, bent beyond repair, water gushing uncontrolled into the creek. The HOA board, or what was left of it, had struck back in desperation. They hadn't regained control of the water supply. The damage was too crude, too messy for that, but they had destroyed his ability to control it too. For the first time, the rancher realized just how far they were willing to go. But what they hadn't counted on was his foresight. You see, weeks earlier, anticipating sabotage, the rancher had quietly installed a backup system, a second shutoff valve hidden further upstream, disguised beneath rocks and brush where no one would think to look. When he discovered the destroyed valve, he didn't panic. He simply hiked further, turned the hidden wrench, and watched as the flow slowed to nothing once again. The HOA's act of destruction had gained them nothing. Worse, it gave him even more evidence of their criminal behavior. The smashed valve, the broken lock, the trespassing, all of it could be tied back to the board. And this time, there would be no excuse, no spin, no legal loophole to hide behind. The rancher realized then that the end game was near. The board was crumbling, their authority gone, their sabotage exposed. And soon, the last pieces of their empire would collapse under the weight of their own arrogance. But he also knew something else. Desperate people don't go quietly. If they couldn't take his water, they might try to take something else. His land, his livelihood, maybe even his safety. The war wasn't over. It was about to enter its most dangerous phase, and the rancher, calm as ever, was ready. The HOA was crumbling. Their credibility gone, their board fractured, their finances drained by fines and lawsuits. What had once been a polished suburban empire now looked like a battlefield of finger-pointing, resignations, and angry homeowners. But collapse rarely comes quietly. And as the rancher knew all too well, desperation breeds recklessness. The board, or what remained of it, had nothing left to lose. And when people have nothing left, they can become the most dangerous. It started with subtle escalations. The survey markers he had once seen on his land returned, only this time they weren't placed by contractors with clipboards. They appeared overnight, hammered in by unknown hands. Tire tracks gouged the dirt near his fence line, far from any public road. His cattle grew restless, spooked by late-night noises, their movements erratic as if shadows had been slipping through the fields after dark. At first, the rancher dismissed it as intimidation, another round of empty threats meant to scare him. But then, one evening, as he drove down a back road skirting his pasture, his headlights caught something chilling. A section of his fencing had been cut clean through, wire dangling loose, posts splintered at the base. Beyond it, fresh footprints led straight toward the creek. He followed them on foot, flashlight in hand, until he reached the spring. The hidden shutoff valve, the one he'd so carefully installed as a backup, was intact. But someone had been there. He found pry marks on the rocks that concealed it, fresh scratches across the metal casing. Whoever it was had been close. Too close. The rancher repaired the fence, reinforced the gate, and reported the trespassing to authorities. But he knew how this would play out. Without catching someone red-handed, the sheriff's office would treat it as vandalism, nothing more. And the HOA board members were cunning enough to cover their tracks. But then came the escalation he couldn't ignore. One night long after midnight, the rancher awoke to a glow outside his window. At first he thought it was a lantern or a distant truck, but when he stepped outside, his stomach dropped. A section of dry brush at the far end of his property was on fire. The flames were small, crackling through the weeds, but in that part of the country, one ember carried by the wind could ignite an inferno. He grabbed hoses, buckets, anything he could find, and fought the flames until his arms ached and the smoke choked his lungs. After an hour of frantic work, the fire was out. The next morning, when he walked the burned patch, he found the evidence, a discarded gas can, half empty, lying in the dirt. This wasn't intimidation anymore. It was arson. Someone had tried to burn him out. The rancher turned the gas can over to investigators, but deep down, he knew where it led. The board! They had finally crossed the line from legal maneuvering and petty sabotage into outright criminality. But as dangerous as it was, the fire also gave him something invaluable, undeniable proof of their desperation. Yet, even with their empire crumbling and investigators circling, the board had one last card to play. A week after the fire, the rancher woke to find a convoy of vehicles parked along the road outside his property. Pickup trucks, SUVs, even a few sedans, all filled with angry residents. At the front was a board member, bullhorn in hand, shouting accusations across the fence line. They had staged a protest, signs waved in the air. Water is a right. End the greed! Community over selfishness. The residents, whipped into a frenzy by the board's lies, believed they were fighting for survival. To them, the rancher wasn't defending his land. He was the villain holding them hostage. The rancher stood his ground. He didn't engage, didn't yell back. He simply filmed everything, documenting the harassment. But as the crowd grew louder, angrier, more volatile, he began to realize how quickly it could spiral. Then, it did. Someone in the crowd hurled a rock. It struck his gate with a metallic clang. Another followed, shattering against a fence post. The protest had become a mob. The rancher called the sheriff's office, and within the hour, deputies arrived to disperse the crowd. The protesters scattered reluctantly, shouting threats as they left. The board member at the front, red-faced and furious, promised the fight was far from over. The rancher knew it wasn't an empty threat. That night, as he sat at his desk reviewing footage, he realized just how far this battle had come. What started as a hidden pipeline had grown into sabotage, arson, and now organized mobs. The HOA wasn't just trying to win anymore. They were trying to break him, but they had underestimated him yet again. The rancher had been preparing for this. Quietly, methodically, he had been working with investigators, compiling his evidence into something bigger than fines or citations. He wasn't just defending himself anymore. He was building a case that could dismantle the HOA for good. He had proof of the illegal pipeline, proof of unauthorized diversions, proof of misuse of HOA funds. And now, with the gas can and the mob footage, he had proof of criminal behavior that went beyond property disputes. The rancher understood the game had changed. This wasn't about holding a water valve shut anymore. This was about destroying the board's grip entirely, removing their power so completely that they could never threaten him or anyone else again. And he had just the way to do it. Through his contacts in the community, the rancher learned that the state attorney's office had been watching the case closely. The scale of the corruption, the misuse of funds, the illegal diversions. It had attracted attention far beyond the county. Prosecutors were waiting for the right moment, the final piece of evidence, to justify launching a full-scale case. The rancher realized the arson attempt and the mob protest might be that piece. If he played his cards right, he could hand investigators everything they needed to bring the board down in one sweeping move. For the first time since the battle began, the rancher allowed himself to think about the end, the possibility of peace, the idea that the board might finally, irreversibly, be stripped of their power. But he also knew how dangerous the coming days would be. The HOA had already crossed into lawlessness. Cornered, exposed, and furious, there was no telling how far they would go before the hammer finally fell. And as the sun set over his ranch, casting long shadows across the fields, the rancher made a vow: whatever came next, lawsuits, sabotage, mobs, or worse, he would see it through. Because this wasn't just about water anymore. It wasn't even about land. It was about standing up to arrogance, corruption, and the belief that power could trample over principle. The HOA had brought the fight to his doorstep, and he was going to be the one to finish it. The rancher had weathered everything: lawsuits, smear campaigns, sabotage, even fire. But as the days passed after the mob protest, he felt the weight of it all pressing down. His land had become a fortress, his life consumed by constant vigilance. What had once been peaceful fields and the quiet rush of a spring now felt like the center of a storm. But storms eventually break. And when this one did, it shattered the HOA for good. The board, desperate and cornered, made one last push. With their funds dwindling and their credibility gone, they filed a new motion in court. This time, they framed it not as a fight over water, but as a matter of public safety. They claimed the rancher's control of the spring created a health hazard for the entire subdivision. They argued that without immediate intervention, hundreds of families were at risk. It was a clever play. On paper, it shifted the narrative from property rights to human welfare. It painted the rancher as a villain endangering innocence. And once again, the board leaned on their political connections, hoping sympathetic ears would override the truth. But what they didn't realize was that the rancher was ready. When the hearing date arrived, the courtroom was packed. Reporters filled the benches. Residents from the subdivision crowded in, some glaring at the rancher, others glaring at the board. Everyone knew this was the final battle. The board's attorneys opened with dramatic flair, speaking of suffering families and dying lawns, of children going without showers and seniors unable to cook meals. They leaned into emotion, playing the victim card with polished precision. And then, when it was his turn, the rancher rose. He didn't waste words. He didn't posture. He let his evidence do the talking. First, he showed the photographs of the illegal pipeline, laid across his property without permission. Then came the records, documents proving the HOA had diverted water for years without permits. He displayed the fines, the citations, the county's previous rulings in his favor, but he wasn't done. He played footage of the mob outside his gates, shouting threats and throwing rocks. He displayed photographs of his burned pasture alongside the gas can left behind. And finally, he presented the inspection reports from the State Water Authority, formal confirmation that the HOA, not him, had endangered the community by mismanaging and breaking the law. By the time he finished, the courtroom was silent. The judge leaned forward, expression stern. And then, in words that echoed through the chamber, the court ruled not only against the HOA's motion, but also referred the board for criminal investigation. Fraud, trespassing, sabotage, charges that could land board members in courtrooms of their own. The rancher had won. Legally, decisively, and publicly. The aftermath was swift. The remaining board members resigned in disgrace, some vanishing from the subdivision entirely. Lawsuits piled up against them, not from the rancher this time, but from their own residents, furious over the stolen dues and collapsing property values. Bank accounts were drained to pay fines. Assets were seized. Some board members even faced indictments. The subdivision itself fell into chaos. With the HOA effectively dissolved, residents were left scrambling. Without the illegal water supply, lawns dried out, pools cracked, and the once pristine neighborhood took on a neglected look. For sale signs dotted the streets as families tried to escape. Property values plummeted. The dream community the HOA had promised crumbled into just another cautionary tale of arrogance and corruption. And the rancher? For the first time in months, his land was quiet again. The drones stopped buzzing overhead. The fences stayed intact. The spring, flowing steadily beneath his control, returned to what it had always been: his resource, his right, his responsibility. Neighbors from further down the creek came to thank him privately. Farmers shook his hand, grateful that he had fought back when so many would have given in. And while the subdivision seethed in anger at their own board's failures, they could no longer deny the truth. The rancher had been right from the beginning. But perhaps the greatest victory wasn't the legal one, or the public humiliation of the board. It was the principle. For too long, HOAs and developers had acted with impunity, believing money and connections gave them the right to take whatever they wanted. This time someone stood his ground, and in doing so, he proved that arrogance has limits. The rancher never sought revenge. He never gloated, never rubbed salt in their wounds. When asked about it years later, he simply said he had defended what was his, and that was enough. In the end, the HOA had built a pipeline through his ranch, thinking they could take his water without consequence. But he had bought the source. He had shut them down, and when the dust settled, the board, their power, and their community's illusion of control were gone, washed away like the very water they had tried to steal. The rancher remained. His land intact, his rights defended, his resolve unbroken. Because sometimes the quietest stand is the one that brings the loudest fall.